Yay.
Good morning and welcome to Deep Dives with New Perspectives. Happy days, Merrylin. How are you today?
I'm great, Michael. And we Aquarians, the sun in Aquarius these days, are certainly celebrating our birthdays. And one of the ways that we astrologers do that is by looking at what we call a solar return chart. And that's a chart that shows the sun at the exact same degree to the minute. And if you're doing it on computer, even to the second that you were born. But of course, that all of that data isn't often given on people's birth certificates, just the hour and time. And it's close enough because not much changes via the second unless you're at the very end of one degree about to go into another. But yeah, we look at these solar return charts and they're kind of interesting. I over the years, often I've not found them profoundly informative. There's a few things that are indicative. And one of the things I did this morning when we talking about return charts is I looked at the United States return chart from last summer, because they're still in that year. And I thought, what does that chart really tell us about this year for the country? And I don't know about you. I mean, there's certain things I look for in solar return charts. And one of the things that I've found very informative is the moon phase that the chart is in, and more specifically, the exact degrees and how that's represented. Now, I didn't look into it that far, but what I noticed about the United States solar return last summer on July 4th was that the moon phase was a crescent phase. And the crescent phase is a phase in which there is enough pressure individually or group wise to continue to go after a particular goal, whatever that is. And so if we look at this well, it's already passed into the second year, but Biden just completed a full year of being the president of the United States. And last summer he was, it was the first summer of his term, and he was, he's had an agenda. We've had the, Build Back Better and the legislation. I forget what they called the one that finally passed, because they had to do some maneuvering before Build Back Better.
And the
The infrastructure one,
right, and the exit from Afghanistan.
Right. And that I think was passed during the summer.
Yeah.
And yet there's so much more that they want to do.
The exit from Afghanistan.
And the struggles in doing it. And right now, I mean, we've had, the Senate has been 50-50 in terms of votes. And so the vice president, who is a Democrat, can sway it to the Democratic side. That is, if all the party members are on the same page. But of course, unless you've never listened to any news over the past year, we know that in the Democratic Party, there are two senators who, for all kinds of reasons, and, have not gone along with the president's agenda. And consequently, they did, and we even got some Republicans for the infrastructure bill that was passed, because I don't think it takes a person in government to see that our roads and bridges and some of the other infrastructures need attention. We even had, not too long ago, a bridge in one of the states collapsed, which we could see more of if they're not repaired and kept up and stuff. The things that we humans build are not necessarily eternal. That is the lesson there. But the efforts that the country, I especially the governing bodies of the country have been trying to do are still, they're still in that crescent phase of putting effort. And to me, when I've over the years that I've looked at lunation cycles, I've come to the conclusion that it is at that stage that a goal is either, you know, continuously supported consciously, or it's aborted, and consequently, in terms of the moon phases, the sun and the moon, if we abort an insight, we don't do anything with it, we continue with the same old ineffective, unuseful patterns or habits. And and so if Congress doesn't get behind Biden's agenda, which I think is a highly supportive agenda of the needs of the American people, we're more things are not just the buildings and the bridges, more things are, I mean, our school systems, our healthcare, our, those things need continuous upgrading and improvements. And if we don't attend to them, God knows. I mean, what flashed in my head as I just said that was, this is quite a while ago, many years ago, where some communities were thinking, well, what if we don't have taxes for fire departments and policing, and we just, have private companies do that. And I believe there was a town that did that with the fire department, and a house was on fire, and I believe that the house next door was on fire. The fire department went to the house that had the fire insurance from them and let the other house burn down. This is, I think, an important example of why taxes, which are really common funds for supporting our common needs, and we tend to de-emphasize that in some sectors of our population. So that's back to the return chart, though. I just see we're in the struggle period for this year, and half of the year has already gone by for the United States return chart. So we're on the waning half of the cycle, and I guess the elections coming up for this fall will be a kind of an approval rating or disapproval rating of the American people in terms of Biden's agenda.
As well as the gerrymandering that's going on in some states in regards to how the restructuring of voting districts have become over the last, 20 years in some areas.
Oh yeah, some states do not think that they do not see the importance of, matter of fact, just to be blunt, the Republican Party has never supported, at least in my awareness, universal voting for everybody who is a citizen of the United States.
Well, it's interesting, you talk about the sense of aborting things, and it's like, I think, like, how do we abort greed? How do we set it up so that there's not, so much being taken by so few people? And I think in a sense of what aborting is, I mean, I think just Trump as a separating force within the Republican Party, many people are starting to talk about this being the death knell of the Republican Party, because the splintering that's going on in its own party beyond, I mean, the Democrats who have its own issues with it, but then, also then the Republican Party is in such a spectrum, and you have people kind of piggybacking onto Trump, which, thank goodness, what Pence came out and said the other day was really incredible, right? He says, no, Trump is wrong. I do not have that power.
Well, yeah, for, in terms of someone like Pence, at least it gives us a sense that he does he does have his
Conscience.
own brain working and his own understanding of laws and regulations, because it is laws and regulations that help us help us to support what we believe to be agreed upon by the kind of country we are, by our Constitution. And if we don't follow the Constitution, the rule of law, what do we follow? An individual's whim, an individual's narcissistic desire to be have a certain title of authority in this country. This is
How's that? I mean, and it's funny in a way, like how it's, and bringing it back to astrology again, we have a man there who has Mars on his ascendant, Regulus, the star Regulus, which is the royal star within the constellation of Leo. And it's like, he really thinks it's all about him, which, that level of self-importance of like royal blood has not really been seen for a couple few centuries, and is actually one of the other revolutions that went along with ours that ended the monarchy in France. And so I think, in some ways we can also see, as our Pluto return happens, of course, how this plays out in the readjustment of wealth and status and opportunity in our country.
One of the things among that you brought up too, in terms of the country, makes me think about looking at, in terms of an entity as large as, say, the United States, looking at the relationship on a yearly basis, a return relationship, perhaps, but the relationship of Jupiter and Saturn, and Jupiter is in some ways, especially, if you look at what we call exaltations, rulerships and stuff, Jupiter is exalted in the moon sign of Cancer. And in so many ways, it represents how the authority or the laws, and then we go to like Saturn. Saturn is like an authority figure, and it's Jupiter that'll preserve what the authority figures have put down, or the Constitution has stated. And Jupiter will preserve that, but it will also bring up situations where, oh, this needs to be enhanced upon. We've learned some new things, and this is where we have certain laws changed over the years, etc. And what's interesting about that, now it's because Jupiter moves a lot faster than Saturn. We will see some changes but not the full spectrum, if just looking at the moon and the sun. And where Jupiter is in relationship to Saturn right now, it's still in what we would call the new phase. Saturn is in Aquarius, and I'm looking at the right. Oh, I'm looking at that. I'm not looking. Anyway, Saturn is in Aquarius, and Jupiter is in
Pisces.
Pisces. I'm not looking. I'm looking at a different chart, and I'm going, no, stop doing that. So they're just, Jupiter is just one sign ahead, so it's still in the new phase. The crescent phase happens 45 degrees, so it's a sign and a half ahead. It isn't quite there. And when we had the elections in 2020, these two planets were just coming together to start this new cycle in 2020. And now, but they're still in it because, well, Jupiter spends about a year in a sign, roughly. Doesn't go by our calendar year necessarily, but 12 months. And Saturn spends about 2.5 years in a sign. So if we look back to 2020 and just in terms of the United States and the election, I mean, it was clearly a reversal in the American people. I've heard many times that when they looked at the numbers and the percentages, that Biden won over Trump as much as Trump had in the previous election over his opponent. And now we're moving, you know, that was like a beginning kind of energy that was sort of saying, wait a minute, the last president we had didn't make the kinds of changes. And these are Aquarian changes because that's where the cycle began at the very beginning of Aquarian. Didn't make the kind of changes we need for the 21st century. So we're going to choose another person. And now we're, you know, still in that new phase. And we see this, I don't know, the polls kind of like don't help much, in my opinion, because it's not really clear what people are thinking when they vote for these things. Obviously, I think many of us have wanted more to have changed by this point in time. But you have to factor in the dynamics of those Congress people as well as the president and say, this is not going to be a fast process. What I think, you know, the little pieces of information, for example, and this kind of feeds into this. I think it was on last Sunday's talk shows where these people who analyze the voting and, you know, the recounts that they've done in some states, especially Arizona, they dove deeply into those recounts and they knew how to look for certain kinds of information, who voted, you know, and it was like many of the Republicans who voted in that election, they voted on a Republican ticket for the most part, but they did not vote for Trump. And, you know, it's sort of like information like that gives it adds to a clarity of understanding that is going on. It's not like that the whole Republican Party has been put into a trance state in which they think anybody who's a member of their party is going to be, nothing else has to be looked at, is going to be the absolute best person to be there. That's kind of, and we're in this the throes of that, where we're part of a group, we're part of a country, we start with being a part of a family, we become this group, that group, a country, a voting population, political party group, et cetera, et cetera. But in none of those situations, even starting with our own personal families, should we succumb to what seems irrational. This is the bottom line of it, you know, or succumb to something that we don't believe in, even if it is rational.
Well, that's gonna be the interesting thing that we're gonna see how it plays out, right? Now that a lot of the planets have gone into a direct motion, you know, we can look at the solar return chart and see. What I kind of like about solar return charts is like where the action is happening too. You know, where are the outer planets traversing by house in the chart, you know, because that'll tell you, you know, is it the relationship house where things are happening? Is it in resources? Is it, you know, is it hitting a little close to home if it's down on the IC, you know, or is it going to be showing up in a really big way because it's up towards the MC or, you know, but way above the horizon. So it says it informs a lot as far. I don't use it too much. I tend to like to look at more like the transits and the progressions throughout the year, because I think those show like a really nice way of how things unfold, but that's what works a little more with individuals. But I think I really like the idea of using like that on a larger scale, because I think it just shows you like, okay, where are the upsets? Where's Uranus happening? Where's Pluto happening? Where's,
Well, and right now we have everything happening. The moon kind of throws us off at certain times of the month because she goes around the whole zodiac in a month's period. But right now we have everything happening from the sign of Taurus, where Uranus is, to the sign of Capricorn, where Pluto is. And so it's all somewhat, the opposite of Taurus is Scorpio. And then, Capricorn comes 2 signs later in that half. So it's not the major planets are in less than half of the almost half, but less than half of the zodiac signs. Or if you put that onto a horoscope, it's half of the horoscope, less than half of the horoscope in terms of the transits.
so really highly focused.
Yeah. And so for example, in the United States, so this isn't the United States chart that exactly, let me get rid of what I've got here. In the United States, oh dear, what happened here? Never mind. United States is a Sagittarius rising chart. The second house where Capricorn is, that's all the planets are from the second house, the transiting planets from the second house to around the 6th house. I think Taurus goes into a little bit. I don't know whether Uranus has entered that 6th house yet or is on the cusp. So it's a very, because this is not equal house charts that I'm talking about. Most of the house systems don't have equal. How you use equal house?
I use whole sign.
Whole sign, not even equal house. Okay, so in the United States chart, though, we just have them in like what, four houses, and it's the lower part of that Capricorn Sagittarius chart, which is the Sagittarius is on the first house of both the Constitution chart and the Declaration of Independence chart. So it's down in that very personal part. It's about our homes, our families, our schooling, our leadership, our creativity. And that's all being, and I'm thinking about the creativity and what we have going on with social media these days and the issues that are coming up legally, et cetera. There's all this kind of turmoil.
And also, I don't know if you heard here in Santa Fe, where they're working, because now the median house here is $500,000. And so someone's donated $400,000 to help teachers be able to buy homes here. So there's home, there's, stability, there's, the teachings, some creating the neighborhoods, making it so it's affordable for everyone to live. I mean, when
I first even moved here, before the prices went up, that was true for the police department. They said many of the police officers were living like in Rio Rancho and driving up here to Santa Fe. This has been an ongoing issue. And I would like to see not only our county, but also the city of Santa Fe look at other policies. I mean, the city is doing all this building of new places, they're supporting, and they've had on the books, regulations about certain percentages for affordable. I don't know how they define affordable. But I've also heard stories that they have let some of the developers, the contractors, pay off so that they don't have to do the affordable thing.
There's a fine, and it's kind of like a nominal fine. And so a lot of them will just say, hey, we're just going to pay the fine rather than build those homes. And that's what's making it really unfortunate.
What I hear are the solutions are just going to create the same other kind of solutions. I mean, the same problems, recycling, like having affordable housing over here. Well, eventually that's not going to be affordable anymore if we just allow this capitalistic system to continue. There needs to be other kinds of thoughts going into it, because I'm going like, oh, you're building that complex over there and it's going to be all affordable. It reminds me of you're probably too young to remember this, but uh, in San Francisco during World War II, I wasn't, not that I remember this,
Okay,
but
good.
I remember seeing the consequences.
Right.
They built, what did they call them? Projects. They were like these they almost look like army barracks. There was a place in the Mission District that has a whole bunch of them. And they had a stigma from the beginning in terms of, oh, those were those affordable houses during the war for people kind of thing. And instead of finding a way to economically fund housing that doesn't look any different from anybody else's, and yet you're not creating or this ongoing capitalistic system that has its downfall every 7 years,
And somehow the wealthy keep getting wealthier each time the 7 years come about, and everyone else is getting stripped of whatever little crumbs they've been able to accumulate. It's gonna be really interesting. I mean, with the Pluto return going on this year, and as you said, just looking at the layout of it, these fierce ideals, right? These are these things that we take so personally when it's underneath the horizon in a chart. These are the things that we, maybe have like more of an instinctual response to, right? We might not be so detached in our views on things. And I think that's what's really nice, that if it does come with that we do have some planets in Aquarius, that we do have planets in Pisces that give some sort of a perspective, but when it's below the horizon, it's very subjective. It's not able to like think of. It's funny, like when you were talking about the Jupiter and Saturn, I like the way you said that about the Saturn, the authority figure. Saturn was Jupiter's, Kronos was Zeus's father,
right.
so holding that, but then also being able to make it larger. Saturn and Jupiter are the great accordions. One expands, one constricts. So it's like, okay, here are the rules, and it's like, oh, Jupiter says, but wait, what about when this, and this happens? There are mitigating circumstances that occur, right? We begin to understand that things aren't as clean cut as like, when you do this, this happens. Why did you do it? Like when you think about the funny thing that's happening with thievery, we're finding ways of like, punishing people even more for stealing things. But, what are we doing to make sure that these people have food? I heard now there's another county here in New Mexico that's going to be trying this thing of giving people a base pay of $500 a month, which is only $12,000 a year. I mean, $6,000 a year. I mean, it's not a lot of money.
I got an email yesterday from Somos Un Pueblo Unido. That organization and a couple of others, forget their names, have been able through some grants to guarantee immigrant families $500 a month. It's kind of based on what happened in the city of Stockton, California, where everybody got 500 as a guaranteed income situation. So that's going to take off, and that seems to be working. And I didn't really pay much attention during the Democratic primaries, when the debates they had, but I believe that the delegate, or the candidate rather, Wang, had that idea of giving everybody a basic guaranteed income of $1,000 a month. And that there's something to be said from the research of projects like that. And of course, I'm sure there's some European equivalents that would offer lots of insight into that kind of
But
thing.
when you think about it, you give money to the people who don't have any money. They're the ones who are more likely to go out and spend that money immediately in the economy. Whereas other individuals, which is what they found with COVID, with everyone getting their bonus checks, the people who had a little bit of money just put it in their savings account.
Yeah, there is that. And I believe in Stockton, it wasn't that everybody just went out and spent it, but that that because some people were just saying, well, people were going to maybe say that the whole economy overall was smoother, better, and people were not irrational about, oh, daddy just gave me $500. I'm going to go blow it in Tahoe or somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, because you remember those stories when we were kids about, the people who would supposedly drive up in their Cadillacs or their Lincolns up to the grocery store and then buy all these groceries and whip out their food stamps. That was always like some little weird talk like in my, and it's like, when I think about it, it's like, yeah, so maybe there's one or two people that might have taken advantage of it, but how many kids is that person may be taking care of? You don't know.
Yeah, it's like not really getting the whole picture.
No,
I
exactly
think
right. Which Jupiter is so good at.
thinking about Jupiter, Saturn, I want to reemphasize this
Yes.
particular point about them. It's like Saturn concretizes the rules. Like one of the things that Jupiter in the mythology was well aware of was, oh, look what happened to my grandfather.
Yeah, Uranus.
And then look what happened to my father.
Uranus.
And then, so I don't want that to happen. So, the recognition that whatever the status quo is, and if it's a good, decent status quo, Jupiter will preserve it.
Mm-hmm. But Jupiter doesn't have any trouble manipulating the situation, himself and others, even when he knows it's going a little, because that's the expansion part. Like, it's kind of like that, how much can I get away with? Which we find a little bit in Mercury, and we find way more in Uranus, but Jupiter has that kind of like, what happens if I,
about 20 some years or more ago, I can remember some astrologers saying they thought that Jupiter was a Democrat and Saturn was a Republican. And I'm going like, I think it's the reverse. Because Saturn, Saturn knows what the rules are and wants everybody to play the rules. But Jupiter kind of does a little bit of what you do. And if you look at the plutocrats to this country today, I think I don't know, this is just tidbits of information here and there. It looks like quite a few of them are Republicans.
Well, that's the thing too. Jupiter can tell a heck of a story, right? So, and what we find is, these things, this false news, everything that's going on Spotify right now over one person who's giving misinformation. I actually really appreciate that there are artists out there who have integrity and also have the clarity within their hearts and their minds and their souls to say, hey, you know what? We're not going to support this. This isn't right. And so, here's this guy who's being forced to apologize, and probably he felt like he had reached a certain level where he can just say and share whatever he wants. But the truth is, our words have consequence. The more people who follow us, we have a greater responsibility to doing something for the collective. The Republican Party is this interesting thing of, what I like to say is like, whatever their latest plan is, it's the complete opposite. So, like no child left behind means every child left behind, unless you have money. There are caveats attached to every single one of their plans, because it's kind of like, their goal is to say, hey, look at what we're, we don't want to change and do anything. We don't want any more government. Meanwhile, they're making more and more money all the time. And, and look, in some cases a little soulless, I have to say. When I look at McConnell, he looks like a weird kind of a combination of a toad lizard.
I think it's a dilemma for that ideology that they're espousing, because it's sort of, I'm also thinking of Jupiter in terms of its exaltation in Cancer, the sign of family. It's sort of like, yes, let the individual develop as much as possible, but there needs to be parameters that are followed. And I think, the mythological correspondence to what's going on is that hands aren't getting slapped enough.
And that's the Saturn part. We've been kind of away. There's been a lot of, I think in the past, it was almost like there was such a strong Judeo-Christian ethos that kept a lot of people, like, don't self-aggrandize yourself too much because, you get struck by lightning, that kind of like this idea. And it's like, people have like stepped far out of that, and they're like really willing to say and do almost anything to get what they want, to get the votes. These Republicans who are jumping on the back of Trump's following because they're seeing, him as a way, and then there's, the two like Cheney, who says, hey, wait a minute, this is Lincoln's party. There was a time when this party was doing real good for the collective. I mean, it was very impressive, when the January 6th anniversary showed up, the only two Republicans were Liz Cheney and her father. Who would have ever thought her father would have shown up? I mean, that, I have to admit, blew me away. And it makes me think of, like, wow, who, how many of us longed back for those days of Bush and Cheney, Because it was, I mean, there was still a way in which there was a decorum. There was still a way in which things were, what do I want to say? Like, this understanding of the rules, and these, little by little, these rules have been removed. We now have monopolies again. We now have these big corporations, which really, in a way, are too big to fail. And all those protections that were put on after the Great Depression, that created the Great Depression, the great stock market crash, all those guardrails have been removed again. So we're in that territory of like, you know what? This country is like really gonna, this is gonna be a heck of a few years. And this year's, we're already seeing it.
Yeah, kind of.
So, and that's the contrast, right? What is my belief versus what is the right belief? I think that's a Jupiter-Saturn conflict too. I think, starting that in Aquarius, starting with that period that started back in December, it's like, it's time for us to understand, we have to start a new relationship. We have to start to have new laws. The ways in which we are relating to one another now aren't as simple as they were back in the 18th century when our Constitution was written.
All right, Michael. Happy February.
Happy Aquarian musings. How can people find you? Can people get readings from you? Can people like get some of your wise, wonderful lunar wisdom and astrological
Yes, they can get
graces?
information about those kinds of consultations on my website, moonwiseastrology.com. I have some delineation of different kinds of readings. It's not your typical kind, although I do those for people because so many people don't realize, what I'm talking about. My main interest is helping people grow in personal consciousness.
Beautiful.
And how I see doing that is through the various cycles, the various planetary cycles. And you can't do the whole picture in one consultation. So, but all of that is on the website, including the fees, etc. And so go to moonwiseastrology.com.
Excellent.
And you, Michael?
People can find out more about me at Coremichael, COREMICHAEL.com. Thank you so much. Happy solar return to the Aquarians. Happy solar return to you, Miss Merrylin, and to me, and to all of us little beings trying to figure out how to be our little individualized selves in the collective. Take care.
All right. Bye for now.